Here we go, let's go. Hi everybody, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a classic review of Nirvana's In Utero. Nirvana was a Seattle rock band, and this was their final studio album, released about 7 months before the unfortunate suicide of the band's frontman, Kurt Cobain. Not much at this point can be said about Nirvana culturally that hasn't already been said a million times. So to kind of sum it up and put it simply, Nirvana was maybe the most defining moment for rock music in the 90s, really a zeitgeist. Their breakout record Nevermind and their rise to popularity sort of marked a changing of the guard for mainstream rock music, a shift away from a lot of the overly glitzy pop music and new wave music, from the hard rock and the power ballads and the hair metal that were ruling the roost at the time. During this moment in music in the mid-80s and the late 80s, there was kind of a dark underbelly of rock music, of underground rock music growing on the West Coast, specifically in Seattle. You can catch a lot of these artists and a lot of these records on some compilations like Deep Six from CZ Records. On this comp, you can hear early cuts from the Melvins, for example. Even Sub Pop, straight out of Seattle, was dropping compilations around this time, like the Sub Pop 100. While Nirvana wasn't on here, there were grunge acts from the West Coast, like U-Men on this compilation, for example. And Sub Pop did release Nirvana's full-length debut, Bleach, which was an incredibly successful record despite how raw the recording was. And this album essentially gave Nirvana the opportunity to go to bat with a major label record supporting them for their next full-length album. The grunge sound had been there for a while with Melvins and Soundgarden and the like, but it just didn't have the national stage yet, nor did it really have the record to kind of create interest in it, and that's where Nevermind came in. This album really sold the mainstream public on grunge with fantastic singles like Smells Like Teen Spirit and Lithium and Come As You Are. And while these tracks weren't singles, it's kind of easy to hear the influence and the connections that were drawn and sort of made on tracks like Lounge Act as well as On a Plane. The more easygoing and sweeter and more melodic cuts on this album had a huge impact on many of the alternative and grunge rock and sort of post-grunge bands that would follow after Nirvana and had a more commercial sound. For a long time after Nirvana broke and Kurt Cobain passed away, the major labels tried really hard to create the next Nirvana. And while there were many very successful rock bands after Nirvana broke in the 90s, it just wasn't happening. But still, the ripples, the waves of influence of albums like Nevermind, as well as In Utero over here, were felt for years. So after such a successful breakout record with Nevermind, you could imagine that Nirvana was feeling quite a bit of artistic freedom from their label. At least it sounds that way, with this record being a tad more raw than what the band had presented on Nevermind. They also teamed up with Steve Albini of Shellac and Big Black fame to produce this thing. While Kurt and Nirvana did get a lot of criticism and maybe were shafted a little bit by the mainstream and the music media a bit, simultaneously they had kind of this imperviousness because their fans just loved them so much. I mean, they were such a cultural phenomenon. It's kind of crazy to sort of see Nirvana continuing to be successful despite having such destructive live shows and on numerous occasions kind of just flipping the bird to the music media. So coming together with a record that was a follow-up to Nevermind, not only did Nirvana just come through the more animalistic, just noisier album, but this record is so very much a reflection on just the sudden popularity of not just Nirvana as a band, but also Kurt Cobain. There's so many lyrics on this record where it's clear he's just reflecting on how the media and just how people perceive him. As far as the sound of this record goes, there's so many guitar blemishes all over this thing, so many shots of feedback, and Steve Albini pretty much leaves all of it in. The bass is really thick and heavy on this thing. Dave Grohl's drums are pounding, which were also characteristics that turned up on Nevermind. I think Steve Albini just gave Nirvana a little bit more body and more layers of noise. He did a great job pulling this record together, and I think the band sounds fantastic as well on some of the more subdued moments here, like on the song Dumb, or even on All Apologies, where you're catching just a little bit of strings hanging in the background, kind of coloring the I guess more subdued spots of the song and making things sound really dreary and sad. So yeah, there are moments where this record is kind of tender, but simultaneously there are spots of real extremity on this album, sort of like where Kurt just blasts some incredibly sensitive and touchy imagery on the song Rape Me. The self-deprecation and the self-hatred and just these feelings of worthlessness are really strong throughout this thing. And it's kind of a testament to Kurt and Chris and Dave Grohl's musical abilities that this album didn't come off as disturbing as it actually is when you just read directly into the lyrics. The music itself is so entertaining and it's so visceral and it's just so hard-hitting and catchy that Kurt's lyrics, being darker than they've ever been on this record, they tend to hit after the fact. When looking into the lyrics on this album, it's really no wonder that Kurt was going through what he was going through. Just all the information about his life up until the point of his suicide that has leaked since his death and since the investigation and so on and so forth. The drugs, his relationship with Courtney, just him being upset over being so popular and just the media kind of just keeping this lens on him, as well as just being a father. Also his depression. Things that unfortunately fans tend to obsess over and think sort of made Kurt the person that he was and think made him a great and an interesting artist, when that's not really so much the case. I think it's the fact that Kurt was a great artist which made him able to channel all those things in such a creative way. The songwriting on this LP, while it's not as concise and not quite as single-driven as it was on Nevermind, there are a lot of raw and very noisy tracks on this record, many of the cuts on here being very riff-intensive. And on top of a lot of these riff-heavy and very noisy and very loud tracks, Kurt delivers some of the most animalistic vocal performances he's given so far, like on Milk It and Tourette's, and one of my favorite tracks on here, Scentless Apprentice. The layers of ear-piercing guitars right at the start of this track are something to behold. It's funny to think just how much extreme music has come out since the release of these Nirvana records, and some of the hardest, loudest tracks on Nevermind and on In Utero are still like some of the craziest fucking things I've ever heard. And the distorted screams that Kurt gives, the shrieks that he does on this track, some of them are just like bone-chilling. Some of my favorite cuts on this record provide these moments of like extremity and just real depravity. And they contrast really well with some of the more subdued cuts on this record. This album flows very nicely. There's a good balance between these harder hitting tracks and the softer cuts, as well as the songs that fit a little more snugly into that single formula. Like on the song Rape Me, which has some incredibly raw vocals at the very end of the track where Kurt is just going off. Although really the selling point of this track are the insanely self-destructive and just self-hating lyrics. They are disturbingly real, and I think even more disturbing when you bring the context of Kurt's life into what he's saying on this song. It's just super sad. I mean, I enjoyed this record a lot when I was in high school and at the very intro to college. But since then, admittedly, I haven't listened to it too much. And not that it's not good, and not that I don't enjoy it. I've just been kind of wrapped up in what I'm doing with the needle drop. And it's rare that I actually get the opportunity to visit old stuff. It sort of depends on where my tastes are pushing me and pulling me. And a lot of the alternative rock and a lot of the punk rock that I used to enjoy, and man, I played a lot of those records to death, man. Sometimes they don't get as much play, not because I don't try to make the time to listen to them, but I don't know, just the desire, kind of the idea to listen to them just isn't there. But digging through my older stuff and seeing this record, I was like, yeah, you know what? I should revisit that. Just see, how it's been sitting for all these years. And it's funny because after learning so much about what I know now about stuff like noise rock and post-punk and so on and so forth, this album, I've really gained newfound respect for it. Because the sound is just immense. It's fantastic. And not only that, but I feel like as an adult, I understand and I've experienced and I've known other people, I've known and seen firsthand the effects of a lot of the problems that Kurt had, and sort of seeing him really beat the shit out of himself emotionally on so many of these cuts can be kind of hard to listen to, and not in a way that makes me cringe or anything like that, but it's just disturbingly real. But moving on to another single from this record, Heart-Shaped Box, fantastic track that as a kid hearing it played on the radio I have a lot of fond memories of, and I love the musicality of this track, just kind of the personality of the bass and the drums, especially during the subdued verses. Nirvana had this fantastic quality where they would just explode into these heavy, hard-hitting choruses, and they do that once again here. But I really love the verses here, not only for Kurt's very pained vocals and his lyrics that are another very sad moment on the album where it seems like he is just paralyzed with fear and anxiety over this relationship, or kind of this very tainted love that he's singing about in the song, as well as things like fatherhood. But also, I love the way that the drums, and especially the bass, kind of tiptoe in this really weird way, keep this very strange rhythm pattern on the verse. Not anything I've ever heard any band in this style attempt again since Nirvana. And the song All Apologies is one of the many moments on this record where Kurt is reflecting on his fame, on his popularity, on the media's perception of him, and he's asking questions sort of in this very aloof way, like, what am I supposed to write? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to say? I feel like I'm this dancing monkey for you guys, and that I'm just this puppet up here, and I'm just here for your entertainment. Kurt had this knack for delivering vocals that had just a mix of emotions in them, not only sadness and depression, self-loathing, but also sarcasm. He had this way of making fun of himself while simultaneously making fun of and taking shots at the people who didn't really think very highly of him in the music media. So yeah, this song says a lot, but I think musically it has a lot of great things going for it as well. I love the hypnotic mantra on the tail end of the track that sort of brings the album out. I like how hypnotic the guitar lines on the track get, and I like how simple the guitar line leading into the song is, and the intro is too. It's so simple, but so effective. And this track, while I don't think many people were predicting what was going to happen to Kurt down the road, just 6 or 7 months from the release of this record, this track certainly feels like a last hurrah. And there are other tracks on here that when you read into them, they say a lot about Kurt's feelings about the band's popularity and just their place in the music industry at the moment, like Frances Farmer Will Get Her Revenge on Seattle, where we have mentions of people being paid and just making a buck off the band, and if Kurt were to, I guess, kind of rebel against that or fight against that in any way, there'd be a suit. My one critique of this track, though, is that I think for Nirvana at this point in their career, the sound that they were bringing on this track was a little stereotypical. I wasn't totally in love with what they were doing riff-wise on this track, but even the more inconspicuous tracks on here, Kurt manages to say a lot, especially on the song Dumb, which is the most somber cut here, with, like I said earlier, those dreary strings hanging in the background. And the poetry here is disturbing, with Kurt talking about really just how happiness is such a fleeting and elusive thing for him. It seems like in theory, maybe that's such a silly thing, being happy, such a silly thing to obsess over. But when you think about, again, how difficult it was for Kurt to just attain that mood and hold it and keep it, it just makes this track another hard listen. And I think he also kind of makes a point about ignorance being bliss a little bit, how you could be happy. It's easy for you to be happy because you're dumb. And Kurt is essentially saying that when he does feel happy, he feels as if he's dumb. Maybe maybe when he's happy, he's not really being fully true to himself or aware of everything around him, maybe because of, sort of the addictions that he was going through as well. But rather than being happy and aware and intelligent and sort of totally coherent and there, he's happy because he's in this dumbed down state. Kurt was just in this really weird hate triangle between himself, the media, and sort of his audience as well, because while the media sort of saw him in the industry too as this cash cow where he didn't feel treated very well, which was reflected in his music, he didn't really care for the messiah role that his fans and his audience were placing on him as well. On the song Very Ape, he refers to himself as the king of illiterature. And on the track Loyalty, he refers to himself as being just drained of his life force and just sapped of his resources. And finally, with the track Radio-Friendly Unit Shifter, this track seems like a bit of an end. I wouldn't say a throwaway. I like the track, but it doesn't really seem to kind of have an overall point to it. It's kind of like a lot of psychobabble. Nothing really adds up, but each individual line says a lot. Like each single line has a bit of satire to it, or at least a point to be made. I think the real message behind this track comes through on the title to this song. I mean, it seems like a bit of corporate jargon, radio-friendly unit shifter, like is this track supposed to be a single that's going to shift, sell more units? Because it seems to be the exact opposite of that. It's kind of this abrasive noise rock crazy talk. If this track illustrates anything, again, it's just kind of the artistic freedom that Nirvana had on this album to kind of parody and satirize and just take punches at the industry, the fans, and Kurt himself all over this album. This record is not only a great rock record, and I think one of the most important albums in alternative rock and modern rock and obviously grunge as well, but it's an album that has just, it's so mentally disturbed and simultaneously so catchy and so immensely popular. It's strange to think that something so abrasive and so unsettling is simultaneously so enjoyable and widespread. It kind of makes this album intriguing, and I think the other thing that makes it intriguing is just how deep of a look we get into the mind of Kurt Cobain when it was at its most volatile. Sorry to be such a downer at the end of this review, but I mean, that's what I think this album is. It's kind of a fucking downer, but a very enjoyable and very well put together downer. And I mean, that's for me what makes a lot of art great. I mean, that it makes you feel something and it makes you think about something, and I guess it makes you reflect on something. It communicates emotions, and this album most certainly does that. If you're into heavy, hard-hitting rock with some noise mixed in there with the guitars and some just crazy-ass vocal performances, some great drumming, some solid and strange, just very creative bass lines too, and some very clear and nicely layered production as well, give this thing a listen. I mean, it's a 90s classic. You're the best. I love you. Transition. Have you given this record a listen? If you haven't, why? It's a classic. Listen to it forever.